Sometimes when you're discovering new ideas, you're really lucky and you find one that resonates with you. For me, a concept that really resonates is resilience. So I think the reason I find the notion of resilience so compelling is because even though it's a term I use in my day job, and that's because the concept of resilience is so important in the world of sustainability and resource management, but the term resilience is something that I can intuitively relate to on a personal level. So resilience, whether psychological or social ecological, is about being able to adapt to change. It's about to keep going when things around us are no longer the same. It's about adaptation. Psychological resilience is also about recovery, being strong when things go desperately wrong. And who has not experienced challenges or hardship? So a spouse comes home one day and tells you that he's leaving. A child dies after a long illness, or maybe a war forces relocation. Things fall apart and you feel like your life is in chaos. But psychological resilience is about putting our lives back together and sometimes even transforming ourselves into someone stronger, more creative, and more caring. I really love visiting civic ecology practices because I meet people. They might be refugees or maybe ex-prisoners, and these people have endured these incredible hardships, and yet somehow they're putting their lives back together. Often as they're putting their lives back together, they're also helping their communities and their environment, their broken places, bounce back from a disaster or hardship, or even to become a better place. I'm going to tell you a little story that illustrates the connections between psychological and social ecological resilience. So it's a story about the Dudley Street Neighborhood Initiative in Boston, which did some incredible work in a poverty-stricken neighborhood. So the Dudley Street Neighborhood Initiative helped to clean up toxic sites. It built low-income housing, and importantly for civic ecology practices, it converted over 600 vacant lots into community gardens. But during the time that the Dudley Street Initiative was getting going, one of its leaders, Paul Bothwell, was riding his bicycle, and he was hit by a speeding car, and he suffered massive injuries. His face and his skull were crushed, and he had numerous broken bones throughout his body. But Bothwell likened the process of healing as being remembered, as putting the broken pieces of his body and his soul back together. Bothwell also compares his recovery to his work as a community activist. Bothwell talks about how rather than an abrupt car crash, his neighborhood suffered a long process of dismemberment. Literally, it was torn limb from limb, heart from heart, and person from person. But just as Bothwell pieced together his shattered body, he describes how little by little pieces of this community have sort of remembered again. They've pulled back together. Work in ecosystem resilience began in the 1970s, about the same time as work in psychological resilience. So ecosystem resilience is about how a forest or a lake or any other ecosystem responds to change. The pioneering work in this area was conducted by a brilliant ecosystem scientist named Buzz Hollings, and he observed how a spruce fir forest in Canada responded to periodic attacks by an insect called the spruce budworm. And he determined that the forests were resilient, that is, they were able to regenerate after the normal periodic attacks that were part of an ongoing cycle of change and adaptation. But the problem was that the forest industry wanted to suppress the insect attacks altogether, so they began this massive spraying throughout the forests. And while this enabled more mature trees so that they could be harvested over the short term, it also meant that more mature trees were more susceptible to the spruce budworm and more devastating insect attacks over larger areas than what had been happening before. So I think that the most important lesson from the work on ecological resilience is that if we remove the natural variability and cycles of disturbance from a system, we make short-term gains, but eventually the system loses resilience and may collapse. And this is what happened in the spruce fir forests in Canada and is happening today in the forest in the western US, where we have tried to control the natural cycles of fire and regrowth. only to have the forest more susceptible to larger and more devastating fires. And we can see the same thing happening in cities. So we've converted river ecosystems to concrete channels, destroying the vegetation that once absorbed runoff during floods, only to see more catastrophic floods replace what once was a more natural periodic flooding occurrence. In short, we've reduced the resilience of urban river systems to respond to ongoing change. And because people are so integrated with the Earth's ecosystems, scientists today talk about social ecological resilience. The lesson from social ecological resilience is that we can't control everything. We actually need to factor in change as something that's normal. Change happens in our individual lives and in our social ecological systems. But humans have agency and the capacity to learn. So we can steer change in a more positive direction. And by responding to smaller changes, we can build our capacity to respond to larger changes. A community that has come together to restore the vegetation along a stream has helped to create a stream that is less subject to massive floods. It's more resilient to disturbance. And coming together to restore the stream ecosystem, the community has also demonstrated social resilience. Social ecological resilience is this ability of a community or a social ecological system to buffer and to adapt to ongoing change and to reorganize when faced with larger change or disaster. So please join me in exploring resilience and its embedded ideas. We'll learn about fascinating concepts like vicious cycles, adaptive cycles, poverty traps, and panarchy as we delve deeper into social ecological resilience.